Number 10. Napoleon versus the rabbits. Napoleon Bonaparte fought some of the most powerful armies in Europe: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain. But according to one of history's most famous Napoleon anecdotes, there was another enemy he was significantly less prepared for, and that was rabbits. In 1807, after the treaties of Tilsit, Napoleon's chief of staff, Alexander Berthier, organized a rabbit hunt. And because this was Napoleon, apparently finding a couple of rabbits in the woods wasn't dramatic enough. Berthier arranged for a huge number of rabbits to be brought in ahead of time. There was just one problem. They were reportedly domesticated rabbits. So, when the hunts began and the rabbits were released, they didn't see Napoleon and think, "Oh no, humans." They apparently thought, "Oh nice, the food people." And instead of running away, the rabbits ran directly towards Napoleon and his entourage. At first, everyone thought this was hilarious. Then the rabbits kept coming. They surrounded the men, climbed around their legs, and followed Napoleon as he retreated towards his carriage. The man who had maneuvered armies across Europe was reportedly forced to abandon the field. And because nobody had told the rabbits they were supposed to be afraid of him, Napoleon would eventually recover from this humiliation. The rabbits, presumably, considered the matter settled. Number 9. Australia deployed soldiers against emus. Now imagine you're a farmer in Western Australia in 1932. The Great Depression is destroying wheat prices. Your crops are already struggling, and then thousands of enormous flightless birds arrive. These were emus, and they were tearing through farmland, eating crops and damaging fences. So local farmers asked the Australian government for help, and the government responded in the most unnecessarily cinematic way possible. They sent soldiers with machine guns. To be clear, Australia never formally declared war on emus. The so-called Great Emu War was a military-assisted wildlife cull. But the nickname exists for a reason. Soldiers were deployed with Lewis machine guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition, which sounds extremely unfair, until you realize the emus were surprisingly difficult targets. They scattered, they ran, guns jammed, attempts to herd them together failed, and after thousands of rounds had been fired, the operation was abandoned with fewer than 1,000 emus killed. The farmers continued asking for military assistance afterwards, but the government eventually decided that maybe deploying the army against birds wasn't the most efficient agricultural policy. And so, in one of history's greatest examples of branding deciding the winner, people have spent nearly a century saying, "The emus won." A war ended in less than an hour. Most wars are measured in years, some are measured in decades. This one can basically be measured with a lunch break. On August 27, 1896, a succession crisis erupted in the Sultanate of Zanzibar. After Sultan Hamad bin Tuwaini died, Khalid bin Bargash took control of the palace and declared himself the Sultan. The British Empire, which exercised enormous influence over Zanzibar, did not approve. Britain demanded that Khalid step down. He refused. So the British issued an ultimatum: leave the palace by 9 a.m., or they would open fire. 9 o'clock arrived, Khalid was still there, and the Royal Navy began bombarding the palace. The Sultan's defenses were overwhelmed almost immediately. His royal yacht was sunk. The palace was devastated, and by roughly 9:40, the fighting was finished. Depending on exactly which starting and ending points are used, estimates range from roughly 38 to 45 minutes. meaning the Anglo-Zanzibar War is widely regarded as the shortest recorded war in history. There are YouTube videos longer than the entire conflict. Number 7. London was flooded with beer. If somebody told you London was once hit by a giant wave of beer, you'd probably assume they were describing a very successful Saturday night. Unfortunately, this was a real disaster. On October 17, 1814, a huge wooden vat at the Horseshoe Brewery in London failed. The vat contained an enormous quantity of porter. Its failure triggered additional damage inside the brewery, and suddenly, a massive amount of beer was surging into the surrounding neighborhood. Walls collapsed, homes were damaged, and people were trapped beneath the destruction. 8 people were killed. And there's an important detail here, because the internet made this story even crazier than it already was. You've probably heard that Londoners supposedly ran outside with pots and buckets, drank free beer, and got completely wasted, and that someone even died from alcohol poisoning. Contemporary reports don't support that part. The real story was already bizarre enough. Number 6. The Great Molasses Flood. Boston, January 15, 1919. In the city's North End stood an enormous steel storage tank filled with roughly 2.3 million gallons of molasses. People living nearby were already familiar with that tank leaking. Children reportedly collected some of the molasses that dripped from it. Then, around lunchtime, the tank ruptured. Millions of gallons of molasses exploded outward, and this wasn't some slow-moving puddle. The initial wave has been estimated to have reached speeds of around 35 miles per hour. Buildings were smashed, structures were knocked from their foundations, people and horses were trapped in the thick liquid, and as temperatures dropped, the molasses became even more difficult for rescuers and victims to move through. 21 people were killed, around 150 were injured. Investigations eventually focused on serious problems with the tank's construction and structural integrity, and the company that owned it was held responsible. So yes, one of the deadliest industrial disasters in Boston history involved a literal wall of molasses. Which sounds ridiculous, right up until you realize how horrifying it actually was. Number 5. Hundreds of people couldn't stop dancing. In July of 1518, in Strasbourg, a woman began dancing in the street. She didn't stop. Then other people joined her, and then more, and more. Within weeks, historical accounts described hundreds of people taking part in what became known as the Dancing Plague of 1518. And these people weren't celebrating. They reportedly danced for hours, even days, to the point of exhaustion. Local authorities had absolutely no idea what was happening. Doctors reportedly blamed the condition on overheated blood. So officials came up with the solution that, in hindsight, was not ideal. They encouraged the dancing. A stage was constructed, musicians were brought in. The thinking was basically, if these people need to dance, let them dance it out. It didn't work. Accounts describe dancers collapsing from exhaustion, and later sources report deaths. Although historians still debate exactly how many people, if any, died directly from the outbreak, eventually, the dancing stopped. More than 500 years later, we still don't know exactly what caused it. One major theory involves extreme psychological stress, producing a kind of mass psychogenic illness. Others have proposed different explanations. but the core event itself is remarkably well documented. Number 4. They put a dead pope on trial. Okay. This one might actually be the most medieval thing that has ever happened. In the year 807, Pope Stephen VI had a problem with one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus. Normally, political enemies can defend themselves. Fortunately for Stephen, Formosus had already been dead for months. Unfortunately for Formosus, that apparently wasn't enough to get him out of court. His corpse was exhumed, it was dressed in papal robes, it was placed on a throne, and then the dead pope was put on trial. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse. Formosus was accused of violating church law and illegitimately holding the papacy. Shockingly, the corpse was not able to mount a particularly effective defense. He was found guilty. His papal acts were declared invalid. The robes were stripped from his body. 3 fingers traditionally used for blessings were cut from his hand. And his corpse was eventually thrown into the Tiber River. The event became known as the Cadaverous Synod. Public reaction helped turn against Stephen VI. He was eventually imprisoned and strangled, so if you've ever complained about office politics, at least nobody has dug up your former manager and put him on trial. Hopefully. Number 3. The CIA tried to turn a cat into a spy. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies experimented with some extremely strange ideas. But Acoustic Kitty deserves its own category. The basic problem was simple. How do you secretly place a microphone close enough to people to hear their conversations? And at some point, somebody apparently looked at a cat and thought that. The CIA experimented with surgically implanting listening equipment into a cat. The idea was that an animal could move through certain environments without attracting the attention that a human operative would. On paper, tiny mobile surveillance platform. In reality, however, it was still a cat. And cats are not particularly famous for respecting mission objectives. The project was ultimately unsuccessful and abandoned. CIA material has since openly acknowledged Acoustic Kitty as a real attempt to implant clandestine listening equipment into a cat. Which means that at some point during the Cold War, highly trained intelligence personnel with government funding were genuinely working on a classified spy cat, and somehow we're about to get more Cold War than that. Number 2. The United States studied nuking the moon. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and suddenly the United States had a problem. The Soviet Union had beaten America into orbit, the space race was underway, and among the ideas examined during this period was something called a study of lunar research flights, better known today as Project A119. The U.S. Air Force commissioned research that considered the effects and scientific possibilities of nuclear detonations in the vicinity of the moon. Yes, you heard that right. There was serious scientific work examining nuclear explosions involving the moon, and one of the names listed among the contributors to the 1959 report? A young scientist named Carl Sagan. The project never happened. Humanity eventually chose a slightly less insane way of demonstrating technological superiority, just landing people there. Which means one of the most famous images in human history became an astronaut walking across the lunar surface. Instead of everyone looking up and asking, did America just explode the moon? But as ridiculous as these stories have been, the final one isn't funny. It's almost impossible to believe, for a completely different reason. Number 1. The man who survived both atomic bombs. On August 6, 1945, 29-year-old Japanese engineer was in Hiroshima on a business trip. At 8:15 that morning, an atomic bomb exploded over the city. Yamaguchi was roughly 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. He survived. Badly burned and injured, he made his way through the devastated city and eventually managed to get onto a train. He went home, and home was Nagasaki. So, 3 days after Hiroshima, on the morning of August 9th, Yamaguchi returned to work. He was explaining to his supervisor what had happened. He tried to describe how a single bomb had destroyed practically an entire city. Keep in mind, this is 1945. And while he was telling the story, there was another flash. At 11:02 a.m., the second atomic bomb exploded over Nagasaki. Yamaguchi survived again. He wasn't the only one believed to have experienced both bombings, but decades later, the Japanese government officially recognized his exposure to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He lived until the age of 93. Later in life, Yamaguchi began speaking publicly about what he had witnessed and became an advocate against nuclear weapons. It's almost impossible to comprehend. One human being stood within a few kilometers of the only 2 atomic bombs ever used in warfare, 3 days apart, and lived for another 64 years. Sometimes history sounds fake because it's hilarious, sometimes because it's bizarre, and sometimes because what actually happened feels too extraordinary and too terrible to be real.